Hello, everyone. This is Codie Sanchez, and I am so excited to be here with you today. I'm with Entourage Effect Capital, and if you all haven't been a part of Arcview's mini webinars to date, then we welcome you. If you don't know who Arcview is, we're the leading angel investment and investing group in the cannabis landscape. And I think it's really appropriate today that Arcview is one of the ones leading this conversation on diversity and inclusion and on some difficult, in fact, conversations in the cannabis industry. And the reason why is not because of me or many of the people who are leading Arcview today, but it's because of the history. Arcview has been continuously focused on profits and bringing more money into the cannabis industry. But more than that, they've been activists and they have been champions for what they believe to be right. So today we're going to talk about cannabis and race, and they are uniquely intertwined in this industry. For many of you who are part of it, let me give you some stats. It's been long documented that African Americans face 4 times the arrest rates for cannabis related charges than their white counterparts. People of color are also disproportionately affected by the effects of cannabis prohibition, while others are able to profit and able to be a part of this industry. Many of those who have been hurt the most have been also left out of this industry generational wealth creation event. So the questions today are big and they're a little scary probably for people to speak about. But I think it's so important for us to think about how to build a profitable while also diverse industry in this world that we live in today. Now, for many of you who don't know me, I'm going to give you a little bit of my history. And I want to talk a little bit about a seed I want to plant inside of you. For those of you who don't know, right now, I'm a partner at a cannabis private equity and growth equity stage firm. But before all of that, before I was in finance and did the investment banking route, I was a conflict journalist, actually. And I lived and worked in Mexico writing stories about human trafficking and drug smuggling. And I can tell you that my relationship that I had with cannabis and what I saw back in those days were things that people never forget once you've seen them. I mean, I've seen things that we as Americans, we don't have to think about. I've seen bodies hanging from highways, and I've seen children taken from their mothers in horrifying ways too early for anyone to imagine. These are stories that are so common on the streets of Mexico that if you were to ask one person along the US-Mexican border and in Juarez, where I was often, they would be commonplace. That's why it's called La Ciudad de Muerte, the city of death. And just as the illegality of our industry has left an unbelievable price on our country in the US, it has on other countries around the world. So I hold very dear this move towards legalization. It is absolutely an opportunity to profit, but it is something that lets me sleep very soundly at night, knowing that I am doing my small and tiny part to have less mothers miss their children for reasons related to drugs. And that is something that I think transcends race. So I want to plant this seed inside of you, that if you've ever, tried to talk to your husband or wife or, been met with a hard no, and then all of a sudden someone outside this circle, mentions the idea and prompts change, and that husband or wife of yours turns to a yes, then you know that change happens when people are primed for it, and change happens when we hear conversations we don't typically hear. I probably never would have been comfortable investing in the cannabis industry if I hadn't seen those shadows in Mexico that was the result of the illegality of drugs. So I hope that some of the conversations you hear today may be outside of your comfort zone, and they may make you change and think. Now, what I want you to think about from a profitable perspective is that I was talking to a friend of mine who runs a very large ad agency called Manifesto Agency. And he told me about a tact. It's called drafting off of the cultural conversation. People do it in PR to newsjack, which means to leverage a specific story that's happening in order to get notoriety and press. Now you can draft off the same cultural conversation at scale. So there's, this is not one small story. This is a story of the time. And that is something that I think we can all do in the cannabis industry today. This social justice mission and this focus on equality and equal opportunity allows companies the opportunity to draft off the cultural conversation. Let me tell you, just give you two examples of a time when companies have done this before. I'm going to share my screen really quickly, and I want to take you back to a time that maybe you guys have forgotten. And maybe you can tell me if you remember this commercial and who it came from and why. Music's a little off, probably not the type of music we would listen to today, but this advertisement is listed as one of the best advertisements of all time. And why? Because it brought together an entire country in the US, and some would say it echoed the cultural conversation of the moment, the scare of the Cold War, the feeling of people that it didn't matter what color we were because we had an opportunity to all come together. Nuclear arms race knows no race. And if you have already seen this one and you believe that, then think about this one. Does anybody remember the 1984 Apple commercial? This one still gives me the chills. And why I show you these, why I talk about the idea of commerce being able to draft off the cultural conversation is because that is the opportunity we have in front of us right now. How can we as cannabis companies, as cannabis investors, and and maybe even as cannabis consumers, how can we draft off of this cultural conversation to make real and lasting change that is both profitable, but also has purpose intertwining? And I challenge you to think about that as you go into your daily endeavors, as you invest in these companies. How do we make the world a better place with commerce and capitalism? I'm a firm believer that you have to have an opportunity to speak in order to have change made, and it's better to have a seat at the table than a sign outside the business. If you're listening to this, then you have a seat at the table, and it's our opportunity to use that seat at the table to make change. All of this to say, I'm very excited for this conversation, and I want to let these humans speak since you've already heard plenty from me. The only thing I'll ask is that it's scary to have these conversations in public. Not everybody says the right thing all the time. So if we're going to allow for a space for difficult conversations, let's allow for many perspectives, for many contexts, and for maybe even a little vulnerability and forgiveness if not everybody does it in the exact right way. After all, we all utilize cannabis. We all are a part of this industry. And if we think about it, we're a lot more human than we are one race or the other. So with that, let me do an introduction to the man, the myth, the legend, David Abernathy, who's going to lead us and be our moderator and guide through this conversation. And he is going to tell you about our illustrious panelists. There's quite a few of them, which makes my heart happy to see so many people of color being represented today. And he's going to let them introduce themselves because, as I was joking with them beforehand, if I did it, we would be on here for a while because these guys have a lot on their plates. I guess they must not sleep much. So David, let me give a little background on David. David's the VP of Research and Consulting at the Arcview Group. In addition to his work here, he teaches the economics of cannabis at Amsterdam University. Really cool school if you don't know about it, worth Google. He is on the board of directors of the Minority Cannabis Business Association, co-owns a miniature golf company, which I didn't know that about you, David, helps run a nonprofit cat rescue organization, which built America's first cat cafe, and sits on the board of trustees of a French-American bilingual school in Berkeley. From 2009 to 2012, he ran a financial services and consulting firm for the medical cannabis industry, with maybe many of you clients on the line that were in the industry itself. So without further ado, I want to hand it over to David David, and give you the chance to let so many speak as people have seats around the table.
Great. Thank you, Codie. That was, as usual, a just fantastic introduction to what I hope to be a really interesting and informative webinar. As Codie mentioned, this is a topic that can be uncomfortable. And as someone who's both Black and white, I've grown up with the privilege of having a sort of split perspective on issues of race. And I know that it can be really uncomfortable to talk about issues of race, especially for some white people, and that's understandable. It's sort of fraught with danger. It feels like you might say the wrong thing, and for some people that makes you hesitant to engage. I would encourage you to move through that discomfort and engage with the topic nonetheless. And I want to kind of set the stage for you here with respect to discomfort. Now, I'm fortunate. I feel very comfortable among people of all races. I'm both Black and white. I look like most kinds of brown people on the planet, and that allows me to move fluently through a lot of different environments. This is certainly true in the Bay Area in Oakland, where I grew up. It's less true in some places of the country. I've traveled extensively in the United States and in some places like the South. It feels very different. In Oakland, I feel very at home around white people and around Black people. In much of the South, I don't feel at home around either because of the different cultural context there. White people and Black people, neither of them really accept me as their own. And that's a little bit uncomfortable. In the cannabis industry specifically, it's very white. It's a very white place. And usually that's fine. To give you an idea, I've been to hundreds of cannabis events and conferences over the years. And for the past 4 years or so, at a majority of events that I've been to, I've been confused with a friend of mine named Sumit. And Sumit is Indian. We don't look particularly alike, but we do look more alike than everyone else in the room. And people aren't confusing us because they're racist. People are confusing us because there's a cognitive heuristic that human minds use, and we start with the things that are most different. But it happens a lot. Sometimes 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 times at a single conference. For me, I'm confident in who I am. I'm confident in my place in the industry. It's mostly just a funny story. But for a lot of people, that can be really uncomfortable. I'd like you to imagine being a Black person in a room full of white people and what that must feel like. In fact, imagine the reverse. Imagine if you're white, imagine that you're in a room with 100 or more people and you're the only white person in that room. It can be intimidating. And it's one of the many reasons why we need to address these issues and make sure that we have a diverse and inclusive and equitable industry. So with that said, I'd like to introduce the 2 panelists who will be participating in this first panel. Steve Hawkins, who is the executive director of MPP, and Shanita Penny, who has contributed in so many ways to this cannabis industry that it's really an honor to have both of you on here. Shanita was the president of the Minority Cannabis Business Association when I joined the board. She's the most recent president. And I'd like to have each of you introduce yourselves. Shanita, why don't we start with you?
Hi, everybody. Before getting into the cannabis industry, I attended an HBCU, North Carolina A&T State University, where I majored in supply chain management. I then went on to work for Harley Davidson, Polo Ralph Lauren, McCormick and Company, Miller Brewing Company. I had an amazing career in supply chain management and realized as the cannabis industry was maturing that this was a skill set that I could bring to the industry, and I certainly had a passion for the plant itself. Very quickly realized after transitioning my consulting business to service the cannabis industry that it was much like every other industry that I've been in. Male-dominated, mostly white male-dominated, except for the world of IT, where I wasn't the only brown face in the room, but I was typically one of a handful of Black people, one of a handful of women. So this isn't anything new. What I was hoping 6 years ago when I entered this space is that because we were creating a newly regulated industry, that we would embrace the legacy industry, and that this would be an industry where the common love for this plant and the desire to see this industry grow in a way that makes sense for everyone. I thought that we'd all have that common ground. And, I quickly realized that we don't. People have been intentional about not wanting diversity, equity, and inclusion in this space, and it can't continue. We've seen the world now change in a way that lends itself to this industry course correcting now and becoming a leader for other industries. So in addition to cannabis consulting and of course advocacy, I'm also an entrepreneur, a partner in a Pennsylvania medical cannabis cultivation and processing operation, Doc House, and also a partner in Shady Pines. That's a subscription box and delivery service based in Oakland. We are a social equity business. So I am one of 25 licensed in Pennsylvania and a social equity operator in Oakland, California, as well as just someone who is passionate about, removing the stigma from this plant and creating an amazing industry.
Thanks, Shanita. Steve, would you like to give us a quick background on who you are and where you come from?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Hawkins. I direct the Marijuana Policy Project, and I've spent 30 years of my career working on issues of policy at the state and federal level, particularly around civil rights issues, human rights, and criminal justice reform. Some of my past positions have been as Executive Director of Amnesty International USA. I served as a senior executive vice president of the NAACP. I served as president of the Coalition for Public Safety, which was a bipartisan effort bringing together prominent organizations, both on the conservative and progressive side, to work on justice reform in Congress that ultimately led to the First Step Act being passed. So that's a bit of my background. I'm excited to be part of this discussion. I'm so happy these discussions around race and cannabis are happening in the cannabis industry. Just last week, we had a similar event where we brought in my friend Derek Johnson and Roland Martin and some others. There is a tremendous interest, I think, among people of goodwill out there within the civil rights community and elsewhere to help we within the cannabis industry frame our work and build a more equitable industry. And so, David, I'm just happy to be part of this conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We're happy to have you. So, Shanita, I think, touched on this a little bit, but I'd like to dig a little deeper. There are a lot of similarities between what we're seeing with respect to race and inclusion and diversity in the cannabis industry that are sort of parallel to what we see in other industries. At the same time, there are also features that are unique to the cannabis industry, a history that those other industries don't share, and just the nascent nature of this industry and the fact that it's developing now. Can each of you talk a little bit about what some of the similarities to other industries are, and what are some of the ways in which cannabis is different from those industries when it comes to race?
Sure. I think any industry has an obligation to understand the history of this country and how any entity, you know, whether you're talking about the new cannabis industry or technology or anything, alcohol, tobacco in this industry, cotton, every entity has the responsibility of owning up to what's been done for over 400 years. And so now you layer on the drug war and prohibition, this intentional effort to target Black and brown people for years. And now that it's legal, you've not created a way from the outset to ensure that those that were affected have that's been reconciled first and foremost. And if they want the opportunity to participate in the industry, that it's there. So while we have a unique set of circumstances with regards to the drug war, we're not unique from any other industry in saying that when things aren't right, we need to do our part to make it right. So whether you are Netflix saying that you're gonna move $100 million to Black banks because you know that typically Black banks don't have the deposits that other banks do, that's doing your part. That's stepping up. The cannabis industry owes not only the folks that were impacted from criminal justice application, but they also owe those communities that were, kind of collateral damage. The communities that were over-policed, underfunded as it relates to every other basic necessity in life. And so if we start there, then we can say, what are we gonna do, A, to positively impact our community? B, what are we gonna do to take it a step further and change what's been happening and affect others beyond our community?
So David, to answer that question on my end, sure, the cannabis industry has to address diversity, equity, and inclusion like any number of industries right now in the United States. In fact, though, the cannabis industry is really at the very beginning of addressing those issues, while other corporations have dealt with issues of diversity and inclusion for many years now. And then there's something more, though. We're at a point now where it's not simply a matter of addressing equity within an industry, but how an industry is going to help build a more equitable society. And that's where the nature of the conversation is going now with how, for example, how Facebook is going to police racist messages on its site, Netflix and its outreach. So that's the new space which the cannabis industry will have to address. And then, as Shanita was pointing out, the cannabis industry is built on the back of 80 years of governmental repression, purposely designed to subjugate a community of color under the war of drugs, going back to Anslinger and his racism that defined how a cannabis prohibition came into the United States in the 30s, sweeping through the Nixon administration, through the crime bill of 94. And that is very unique to a cannabis, and does, I think, speak to specific remedies that our industry has to be thinking about and be clear-headed about, and I'm sure we'll get into that some more.
Great. So you mentioned Netflix and some of the stuff they're doing. Does either one of you want to talk a little bit about what some other industries have been doing with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion that we might be able to learn from in the cannabis industry? initiatives that other companies have taken that are a big deal, or are taking big steps in the right direction, or maybe things that companies have done that are a step in the wrong direction, or kind of a waste of time.
So David, if I can start just to say, I worked for years at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and throughout the 70s and 80s, LDF sued, corporate America around employment discrimination. And what we saw at the end of that, coming into the 90s and into the 2000s, is, corporate America began to look different. The Coca-Cola that you walk into today does not look like the Coca-Cola that you walked into in 1975. I start there to say that on a fundamental level, this industry has to be asking many questions. Who are our business partners? Are we diversifying our business partners? How, are we diversifying our board of directors? What are we doing to diversify our staff? How are we diversifying our vendors? Are we publishing and offering sponsorship of Black businesses and media? And then on top of that, and this goes to the nature of the cannabis industry as well, how are we giving back to the community that was that was targeted by the war on drugs, and specifically cannabis prohibition? So what steps are we taking around advocacy, around expungement, around, even things as simple and basic as scholarship funds in communities that have been impacted? And it's not enough, David, that a company do one of those, like one and done. A company has to see equity as something that goes throughout the effort, right? And investors should be looking for that in companies that they invest in. So when I think about what other companies are doing, our industries are doing, and where cannabis is, cannabis still has a long way to go on something as basic as diversity of a staff and positions. There needs to be a rule within the cannabis industry like there is in the NFL. I'm happy if you all want to call it the Hawkins rule, but before you hire a senior executive in your company, no one should be hired unless someone of color has been brought in and interviewed and considered among the final selection. If the NFL can do that, this industry can certainly do that. And I'll turn it over to Shanita.
What I'd like to point out is that when an industry or a company has really put in real effort to address this, it didn't start with hiring. Over 20 years ago, when corporate America was saying, hey, we don't have enough diverse talent, they went to academia. They created the PhD project because when they got to the root of the problem, they realized there weren't enough Black educators to wrap their arms around, right, and create the pipeline of talent that would lead to diverse corporate boardrooms and staffing. They created the PhD project, and so you started there and addressed it at the university level. So then, a couple years later, by the time I was sitting in a university, and Harley-Davidson, a company who for their existence of an internship program recruited from Michigan State, University of Tennessee, schools that were known for supply chain programs. But they thought, hey, we need diversity, let's go to an HBCU. They came to A&T, they interviewed, and they took us in, and they put us in the same program. There wasn't anything different than what the interns from these other schools were experiencing. And, we took it upon ourselves, and, we were absolutely kind of pushed in this direction. When we left the HBCU, it was like leaving your mom's house. You have to go represent for every Black person so that they will have a chance, the same chance that you had. If you mess this up, they won't come back to A&T or any other HBCU. And so we walked in, I'll never forget, it's Harley Davidson, I didn't know this when I walked in, but it's very casual. The guys wear t-shirts, they wear jeans, and they ride their bikes to work. We walk in, we're suited, we are, ready to impress, and they're kind of like, you look great. Don't wear that tomorrow. And then we had to acclimate, right? There weren't a lot of Black people there, but there was an Aggie. There was one A&T alum who came down that very first week, found us all, gave us personal phone numbers and contact information, and made sure that this environment would be inclusive. So it's not enough to go hire and say you're going to go find these people. You got to take it a step further. You have to make sure that the environment that you're bringing them into allows them to thrive. If it's a hostile environment, I can be the most talented person, but I'm not going to perform at my best. So I think what the cannabis industry has done wrong is look at diversity as, let me go find a Black person, let me go find a woman, as opposed to going to find the right fit from a skills perspective and all of that, experience level, background, any of that. But then if you're going to diverse places, if you have a diverse train of thought, if you're not suffering from, unconscious bias and haven't ever expanded outside of what's comfortable for you, then you won't be able to go recruit diverse talent. So what's important is that we look at not only diversifying the existing entities, but then making them inclusive. And I think the NFL's rule was then has now been implemented in media. Condé Nast now has that rule. It's the Beverly Johnson rule, but it's the same concept. You have to interview. You have to go find the talent. And what we've done is allowed folks to check the box. Add your wife to the ownership to this company. And now we're saying we're half, woman owned, or add a Black person, we're minority owned. And then, 12 months later, when this business is operational, this person has no, real influence on the business. They may not even have real equity in terms of ownership at this point. And so we have got to get real about what it is that we are saying when we say increase diversity, make it inclusive, and then also discussing equity in its proper context as we talk about ownership, as we talk about equitable access, equitable opportunities, and things of that nature.
Absolutely. One of the consulting projects that Arcview's consulting arms is currently working on is a greenhouse cultivation, a large-scale greenhouse cultivation in Southern California, which was really created as a for-profit spinoff of a nonprofit that focuses on helping formerly incarcerated people. And this is a project that we're still in the planning stages of, but one of the things that's really important is that we create not just a greenhouse grow with a promise to try to hire formerly incarcerated people, but also an infrastructure around that. And what we found is that there are certainly some things that you have to do that you wouldn't otherwise have to do, but there are also some really big advantages. We're working with the local city very closely. We have access to grant money to work with the local community college to develop job training programs so that we have a pipeline of candidates who have the skills that we need, and we don't have to spend the money on that training. The job training program will be developed specifically for our needs. We will have peer counselors available, other formerly incarcerated people who will be able to pick up the phone when someone needs help, or to help folks with things like housing, to help with issues of readjustment. And so what we're finding is that, yeah, there are sort of extra things that we need to do, but it also opens up these unbelievable new opportunities. And we're looking at the research and companies that regularly hire formerly incarcerated people and do a good job providing the necessary infrastructure to give them a second shot, enjoy much higher retention among their employees. There is a real sense of loyalty, and this is going to create a pipeline for taking all of these folks who really it's a difficult situation for them trying to come back into a society that is full of stigma and barriers, and give them a path towards really succeeding. So I think that you hit the nail right on the head. It's not just about hiring people, it's about finding them, it's about creating the education opportunities to feed a pipeline of people. It's about making sure that you have the resources and the infrastructure to make sure that those people are set up for success. So it's interesting. There's a lot of talk in the cannabis industry about social equity programs, specifically social equity programs designed around licensing. There are certainly lots of things that need to happen to get to an outcome of a more diverse and equitable and inclusive industry. Can you talk a little bit about sort of some of the things that might be able to be addressed through policy, either cannabis policy specifically or legislative policy, legislative and regulatory policy more broadly? And what are some of the issues that are going to need non-policy or non-regulatory or legislative solutions?
I like the idea of social equity being a priority at this point. You're not talking about legalization anywhere in the country without talking about social equity. And we're seeing that really evolve into something more comprehensive. And so I look to Illinois as the model where you're, again, reinvesting in the communities that were impacted. You are also creating a specific lane for business opportunity. And then I think where you marry industry, right, is that the government, state government, city government cannot finance these programs, but we have an industry that can help support it. What I don't want to continue calling social equity is a large cannabis company or well-funded entity partnering with someone in the name of social equity, but there's no development. And we saw that a lot in California. That's what opened up the opportunity for my partner and I. We were reacting to COVID because of the increased demand for delivery and had the opportunity to actually incubate a business. Now, if we were to just do what Oakland requires and give them 1,000 square feet of space to operate in, we know what happens then. They're more likely to fail because they don't have the wraparound support they need from an experienced operator, from someone who's, just been in business, someone who knows how to navigate a heavily regulated industry, and someone who can go in and deal with, zoning boards, the state regulators, any of the entities that you have to, do business with as a cannabis business. So we need to see the social equity programs legislated, but then we also need to see some accountability from whether it's city, state, or in some future, the federal government overseeing what's happening there. And the state of New York has started that. You won't apply for a license, a cannabis business license in New York, and say that you're going to work with social equity operators unless that operating agreement, all of those terms have been vetted by the regulators. That's the direction that we need to be moving in as we talk about social equity programs from the business side of things.
Yes, David, I agree totally with what Shanita's saying. I think that certainly with the events in the country over these last few months, everything around social equity and cannabis is going to be magnified in all of the efforts to see more legalization in the states. This is going to be top of mind. I'm holding out promise too that the Illinois model will be fruitful and productive. It got off to a slow start because of the pandemic, but still holds promise. But David, you also talked about what else can be done that doesn't have to do with government policy, and that's so important because we should not be waiting for mandates from the government to define what social equity is going to be in the cannabis industry. The industry has to have a collective responsibility to further social equity, apart from anything that is being mandated through regulators. And I gave some examples before, but that goes to who we advertise with. I mean, I had Roland Martin on a panel last week. Roland reaches 400,000 people, well respected in the Black community, has a program twice a week around cannabis, and would love to have any number of industries come in and be part of his program, right? He's just one example. But again, what efforts are we going to put in place to diversify, right? As new CEOs are considered for the cannabis space that are coming from outside of the industry, as the industry matures, how many people, African American, Latinx, are going to be included in that CEO final selection process? So those are all things that have nothing to do with a government regulation, but have everything to do with how the industry thinks about its future. And lastly on that, it is not only the future of the cannabis industry, but it's the future of the United States, David. And you started out, I think, eloquently talking about, your experiences as someone who's biracial. Right now, we know the demographics tell us that by the year 2040, people of color will be in the majority in the United States. As we speak, there are more 5-year-olds in the United States that are of color than there are, white five-year-olds. This country is catapulting towards a multicultural democracy, and the industry has to understand and appreciate that, because it's going to have to do with companies' survivability, how brands will get identified, and how we will embed ourselves in terms of what the future of the country looks like, and what role we want to have in shaping that future.
Thanks. Yeah, along those lines, Shanita, what does the cannabis industry have to lose if we don't get this right? If we don't properly prioritize these issues?
We're starting to see a little bit of what's going to be demanded of us going forward. Just a few weeks ago, Dixie made a big announcement about changing the name of their company. When I entered this industry, that name, and they're a leader in the industry, that name stood out to me. It completely caught me off guard that a company formed, in, I don't know, the late 90s, early 2000s, anything beyond, maybe 1960, that we wouldn't see this. Okay, so that was me coming into the industry. A few years later, as I led the Minority Cannabis Business Association, I got a call from a medical cannabis patient in Maryland. She walked into a dispensary and found a strain of cannabis called Strange Fruit. Now, this Black woman, veteran, who's lived through the civil rights era and knew exactly, what she was seeing, needed to make sure. She's like, I know they come up with all kinds of crazy names for cannabis, and, we don't put a lot into them, but this one is standing out. You know, I want to talk to the folks that manufactured this. And, you know, they said, oh, we wanted to bring light to strange fruit, Billie Holiday, all of what strange fruit represented in terms of the lynchings that were happening in the South, and then bringing awareness to the history, but then moving forward. Well, long story short, as you all probably know, you know, prior to maybe Illinois coming on board, it usually took 2, 3, 5 years for a cannabis company to apply for a license and then get product on the shelf. Well, that was the case. Someone in that company didn't put the time and effort into ensuring that the campaign, the education campaign behind this, that it hit. They were more concerned with putting product on the shelf and generating revenue, and it was a disaster. They quickly pulled the strain, renamed it, and have moved on since. But that's problematic. If you don't have diverse leaders in your company, you're going to make mistakes like that. You may not get a chance to course correct like Grassroots did. You may not have a chance like Dixie is being afforded at this particular time. Because we saw a couple of years ago a cannabis entrepreneur who called the police on a young Black girl selling water in front of her home. And the industry stood up and said, we're not going to tolerate your racist behavior. We won't support your company. Dispensaries pulled the product. Advertisers, you know, everybody distanced themselves from this woman. That is where we are going with cannabis. It's happening with every other industry. We want to know who's on your board. We want to know who you're hiring, what you're doing. We also want to know who you're supporting. Look at what's happening with Facebook. Investors, that stock crashed when, you know, advertisers started pulling out because Zuckerberg wouldn't check Trump. So you are going to have to not only make a statement, but stand by that. You're going to have to live up to it. And now, folks, and this is happening right now in your industry, in the cannabis industry, folks are looking at your current state. Oh, you don't have a diverse board? We understand. But where are you going? We're going to check back in a year from now. Oh, you scaled? You're in 3 states now? What did you do differently in any of those other states? The reality is this. There's not a single industry where diverse boards aren't showing up as better, companies with diverse boards aren't showing up as better performers. They're able to attract and retain the best talent. And so while you're thinking about diversifying these cannabis companies, you still have to, again, retain that talent. So if they're coming into a hostile environment, forget it. They're going elsewhere. And they're going to tell people about that. And so now you're not going to be able to recruit. And then it's going to trickle down and consumers are going to know what's happening. So, you know, what I want to really encourage folks to think about is the fact that regardless of the industry, less than 1% of venture capital goes to Black founders. If we don't address those root issues, those root causes, then we'll never see real diversity and ownership in this industry because, again, less than 1% of venture capital is going to Black founders. We know the only way to fund a cannabis business today is through venture capital, private equity, folks like you all. And so we have to get serious about, again, changing from the top down how we started this industry. That means, yeah, policy, social equity is nice, but who's diversifying the table when we're actually legalizing in the state? Who's gonna stop, you know, a handful of guys from saying, yeah, we only need 10 licenses in this state, and say, you know what, let's have an equitable, diverse industry. Maybe we need 25 and 10 should be this size. We should have a middle ground and we should have some small operators. That's where we need to be going with this.
Right, so we've got to wrap this panel up in a couple minutes here and move into our second panel. Do either of you have any sort of final thoughts, important takeaways, things that you hope people really take to heart as they move on after this webinar concludes?
David, for me, David, folks should realize that we're still building the culture that's going to define the cannabis industry. much easier to shape it at this point from scratch than once a culture has been established, it is then very difficult. So we're still at the beginning in this industry. There is still time to make sure that we course correct and build the kind of industry that Shanita was just portraying. That's the point. That's the comment that I think I want to leave folks with. Is that you have an opportunity here, and if we don't course correct, and if we don't think about this in the kind of way that Shanita, I think, just very eloquently said, there is going to be pushback, right? No business wants to end up, on the end of my friend like a color of change petition, right? No one wants to have Rashad Robinson, who I know well, issue a color of change petition on your company. So we have to take these issues seriously as we move forward. And I'll stop there.
I just encourage everyone to look in the mirror, because, you've got leaders and you've got decision makers who don't know what to do right now because they haven't dealt with this within themselves. And so, again, I just encourage you to start with yourself, and then make it a point to every single day be better than you were as it relates to unconscious bias, as it relates to just, being thoughtful about how you can diversify your everyday life. There is a huge movement in this country right now around Black dollars. And if we can't find the product made by a Black producer or a company that cares about us, we will create the business and we will have it. We're not going to continue to be consumers to companies that don't care about us or our communities or the future generations of us.
Great. Thank you very much. Both Shanita and Steve, I think, are sticking around for Q&A after at the end of this webinar. So until then, I'll let you guys take a break, and we'll move into our next panel. All right. So while we're getting the panelists online here, I'll give just a quick list of who they are, and then we'll let them introduce themselves. So we are very fortunate today to have Dr. Chanda Macias. She's the CEO of Ilera Holistic Healthcare, which is the medical marijuana cultivator and processor for the state of Louisiana. We've also got Karim Webb, who is an entrepreneurial activist and CEO of Fourth Movement. And I'll let him talk a little bit about the really important work that Fourth Movement is doing. And we've also got Khurshid Khoja, who is an attorney and the principal of Greenbridge Corporate Counsel. He also sits on the board of the Minority Cannabis Business Association with me, and really is one of the world's leading, if not the world's leading, expert on social equity policies. And so I'm really excited to have these panelists with us. And Chanda, why don't you kick it off and introduce yourself? I think you're muted, Chanda. I think you're still muted.
How about this?
There we go. Thank you.
Oh, wow. Advanced technology is very interesting. And in the life of COVID, I feel like I've gotten worse at it. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you for the opportunity to allowing me to have a voice on this platform with our investors in the cannabis industry. It has been very interesting how this conversation has came around, and I am Dr. Chanda Macias. I am first and foremost a biomedical researcher. I have studied cancer for many years and pivot my way into infectious diseases. I started out in this industry out as a dispenser in Washington, D.C., and now I'm a multi-state operator operating out of Louisiana. And so I'm so excited to have partnered with Southern University to be the first historically Black college and university to launch both CBD and a THC medical marijuana products. So just having that platform itself has been just my own blessing and the way to give back to a community that gave to me. So I did go to Howard University at HBCU for undergrad and graduate school, but more importantly, I've conducted research throughout the world and had over $10 million in grants from NIH, NSF, and the Department of Education, and use that information to really focus on natural medicines and healthcare disparities throughout my career. And so now, coupled with my MBA in supply chain management, I'm able to operate in multiple states and bring legal medical marijuana to the forefront and help patients in real needs that the patients have. So thank you for having me today.
Thank you. Karim?
Yeah, sure, David. Thank you for the introduction, and thank Arcview for the platform and everybody who's tuned in today, and the co-panelists, and obviously Stephen and Shanita, who were outstanding in the first panel. Yeah, I'm the founder and CEO of Fourth Movement. We are a platform by which people who qualify for social equity, we find and vet and train people to really leverage that opportunity to improve outcomes in communities. And so we do it comprehensively and at no cost to them. So we 100% finance the opportunity and then surround folks with all the tools necessary to compete at the highest level in the retail space.
Excellent, thanks. And Khurshid?
Oh, well, thank you for that very kind introduction, David. Having sat on and sitting on the MCBA board with you and having served with Chanda and Shanita previously, I certainly would not hold myself out as the world's expert on social equity provisions, but it's very kind of you to say. I sit on the board of the Minority Cannabis Business Association with a lot of really stellar entrepreneurs and activists who are very dedicated to advancing social equity in the industry. And so I'm really proud to serve with them. I also happen to sit on the policy committee of the MCBA, and that I co-chair that with our current president, Jason Ortiz. And in that role, I essentially helped to draft model ordinances and bills along with other lawyers that I draft into the process, as well as MCBA members that contribute input as we develop those bills. I also am the chair of the National Cannabis Industry Association board, co-chair their National Policy Council as well, and work with our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee to advance social equity within the industry on that front as well. And as you mentioned, I am the founder of Greenbridge Corporate Counsel. We're a transactional and regulatory law firm in the cannabis industry. We've been doing it since 2012, and just really proud to be here, really amped to be here with all of these amazing panelists. And yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you. So I'd like to start with sort of a look at the evolution of social equity programs since legalization started. Why did they come about? What did they look like when they started? How have they evolved? And where do you see the future of social equity provisions in the cannabis space?
Is that directed to me, David?
Yeah, why don't you start, Khurshid?
Okay, sure. So, I think when social equity programs started, they started off, I believe the very first one was in Oakland, California. A lot of California local jurisdictions followed suit, and then we saw other states, Massachusetts, Illinois, also adopt social equity programs. At their heart, at the sort of 10,000-foot level, what these social equity programs are intended to address are an applicant's experience of harm from disproportionate policing and enforcement of cannabis laws. And what that means in each individual jurisdiction can and does vary, right? So in virtually every jurisdiction, an applicant with a criminal record of nonviolent cannabis offenses committed in that jurisdiction will qualify as a social equity applicant. Usually having an immediate family member who is arrested or convicted of these offenses will also qualify you if you've shared a household with them. Long-term residents in a neighborhood or community that has experienced disproportionate policing and enforcement also tends to qualify you in most jurisdictions, though the length of residence can vary. Some jurisdictions like Illinois will allow you to qualify if you have a sufficient number of employees who meet the foregoing criteria. Other jurisdictions will qualify you for some of the benefits if you agree to incubate a licensed business by an entrepreneur who meets the foregoing criteria and holds majority interest in their business. Although some jurisdictions will also allow you to hold less than a majority. For example, LA will allow you to hold 33 1/3 and still be a tier 2 social equity business. And some jurisdictions incorporate additional criteria like low income status. And so that's kind of evolved as time has gone on. It's important to note that in almost every instance, explicitly race-based criteria is usually avoided on constitutional grounds to avoid conflicts with equal protection clause and or state laws that prohibit affirmative action. What we've seen since the introduction of these social equity ordinances has been a tightening. There's been a lot of gaming by folks who want to take advantage of social equity benefits, but also are trying to divest the social equity applicant of their ownership and control as soon as they get the license, right? And so there's been a lot of that going on, unfortunately. And so jurisdictions have really tightened, what types of agreements you can enter into with a social equity applicant, what the conditions of transferring your license are as well. And so most recently, the city of LA is an example where they've really fine-tuned the definition of what an equity share is to essentially say, hey, there is no conditional ownership, right? You own that stake in that business outright if you expect to qualify as a social equity applicant. And if there is any kind of gaming of that, any kind of condition subsequent to getting a license where that social equity applicant is divested of their control or their ownership, then those benefits are gone. That is a positive development because there is a lot of predatory. There are a lot of predatory practices going on right now in jurisdictions that have social equity ordinances, with people wanting to game that system. The flip side of that, though, is we also want to ensure the success of the social equity applicant. Want them to scale, want them to be able to raise money in the future if they want to scale up or expand, and we want them to be able to exit too, have a successful exit as well. And so some of these really well-intended provisions that are tightening up some of the loose ends in these social equity ordinances may have the effect of foreclosing exits and foreclosing potential financing options in the future as well. So something I'm happy to chat about further, but that's kind of my view.
Excellent, thanks. Karim, a lot of the focus on social equity programs to date has been around providing licenses to social equity applicants and sort of getting them in the business, getting the foot in the door. Can you talk a little bit about why it's really important that we do more than that? And I think that some of the stuff that Fourth Movement is doing is really designed to address the fact that simply giving a person a license and sending them on their way is not necessarily enough. While it's a good first step, it doesn't get you the whole way there. You're muted.
Yeah, I think for us, it begins with really our own understanding of what social equity is, or at least what it ought to be, and then trying to reverse engineer progress in that stead. So, a license is not social equity. It's just a license. And in a limited license market, it may have value depending upon how it's executed. But when a policymaker creates policy, what's implied is that it's in the interest of all the citizens. So in other words, if there's an area of a jurisdiction or of a state where individuals have been disadvantaged in their life by how they were over-policed or unfairly treated, and we're going to leverage these limited licenses in order to, what's implied is improve outcomes, then what also must be true is that license has to be leveraged to be able to receive the resources that are going to improve whatever outcomes make things more fair and are in the benefit of all of society. To us, it's like health outcomes, average household income, and educational attainment, which will probably happen when people make more money. But social equity licenses are, in my opinion, probably more or less, going to become distressed assets, more so than actually tools to leverage, because people won't have access to capital, and in some instances, the acumen or the support systems to compete in a very highly competitive, expensive industry, to stand up competitive businesses with respect to market share long term. And so at Fourth Movement, that's what we do, is we reverse engineer. I come from the franchise space, so our model is very similar to a franchise. I'm a franchisee of Buffalo Wild Wings, and my parents, who both, grew up in single parent households in South LA with no money, did become McDonald's franchisees. So I grew up in that space and saw the benefit of being able to leverage systems like that. And that's basically what we stood up at Fourth Movement, is the ability to acquire the capital necessary to hire best-in-class marketing. Some of the things that Shanita and Steven said in the last panel, to be able to do that around supply chain, to be able to do that around HR and accounting and go-to-market strategy and technology and all the things that you're going to have to do if you want to open right down the street to a well-resourced MSO-owned dispensary. And be competitive from a consumer perspective, and ultimately be successful enough to have the resources, that will produce the outcomes that are in the interest of our communities.
So, and sort of along those lines, one of the things that is really important in any industry, and certainly in the cannabis industry, is relationships between individuals and relationships between companies. Chanda, can you talk a little bit about how companies can begin to forge relationships with Black-owned businesses, with social equity businesses, and what are the steps that they can take to make sure that they're creating those relationships and sustaining those relationships?
Well, I'm going to speak directly from my true experience, my authentic experience. When I started in the cannabis industry, there were less than 10 states that were legalized at the time. And our ability to have access to resources, meaning when we speak, or when I speak on minorities, I think about both women and people of color. So for myself, I didn't have access to people or operators that looked like me that was willing to help me with some of the fundamental steps in running a dispensary at the time. And so I remember specifically that I went to my first Women Grow meeting, and it was there. We connected with all these wonderful women and all these wonderful people in the environment, and we educated each other. We made contacts. We had, you know, when I didn't know how to operate an effective POS system and what software I could use, during that networking session, I was able, in fact, to get in touch with people in Oregon that was more than willing to help me. And so when I say that, you know, years later, as many of you know, I'm the CEO and chairwoman of Women Grow today because of the impact they have had on my career firsthand, no question about it. And so I think about what can we do? Exactly what we did. We met our community exactly where they were. They wanted to know more about the industry. They wanted to know how they can get involved. And so now, even as a multi-state operator that believes significantly about outreach, I still focus on that. Now, practically, what I would say to do is that open up your operations to an open house or an event where you as the operators, as you as the owners, or even as the board members can meet your community. Your community will reach out to you. I think it's important that you pair up with community leaders in cannabis and help them engage them in what we call in diversity and inclusion programs. Because I know at these many meetings that everyone is wanting to be a part of the cannabis programs. So once you have at those meetings, then you can start to bring those vendors in-house and to see if there is a needs assessment there. And so sometimes you'll find that synergy. Maybe we may not be able to satisfy all your needs, but there's some aspects that they can maybe contribute to. So even for me in one of my operations, I had a person that was interested in laboratory testing. He was a doctor. He has educated many people, higher degree PhD in chemistry, had existing lab, but couldn't afford to pay insurance on his facility if he wanted to test hemp and cannabis. So for what that looks like, you know, you put them in that environment where there's other multiple state operators and we all come together to say we're going to use this vendor, then he's able to generate enough revenue to in fact pay for his insurance and get his business off the ground. And I think that we need to be very thoughtful of sometimes how other people are learning how to maneuver in this operation. And I think there should be key performing indicators that multiple state operators actually use to making sure they're inclusive and diversified in their operations.
Excellent. Khurshid, you mentioned, you touched on sort of some of the criteria that determine who is eligible to be a social equity applicant. I'm also curious to dig a little bit in what mechanisms exist in social equity policies to get social equity applicants licenses. Like how does that work? So I've now qualified as a social equity applicant. Are there, you know, a certain number of licenses that are set aside just for social equity applicants? Do I get priority in application? How does that side of the process work?
Yeah. Well, so in almost every jurisdiction that has a social equity program, at the outset, in order to benefit from the program, you need to have a certain ownership stake in the business, right? So that's sort of at a top level. You've either got to have majority ownership and control of the business, which sort of gives you, that's a big benefit, obviously, of being a social equity applicant, is you have that level of control and ownership. But the ordinances themselves, what they do essentially is after they mandate that ownership percentage, they also, as you mentioned, they provide priority licensing in many jurisdictions. So a lot of California local social equity ordinances started with that benefit, where There are, as a result of zoning, a limited number of licenses de facto, right? And so if you are, and speed to market matters. And so if you are able to get a priority license, get licensed first, get into the marketplace first, you're able to compete with some of these legacy folks who operated under Prop 215, for example, in California, right? And any newcomers that are coming in from other states. And we saw a lot of that. We saw a lot of operators from other states coming into California when that opened up and expressing interest in social equity as well. In some jurisdictions like Illinois, it provides you with additional points on your application, right? So you don't necessarily have priority licensing, but you do actually have, 20% of your points in Illinois on your application. Up to 20% you can get for being a social equity applicant. And so again, when you're dealing with a limited number of licenses, either de facto or de jure, that matters. And those 50 points are very valuable. So you're able to get that kind of leg up as well. There were jurisdictions, I believe Ohio tried to set aside licenses that got subjected to a constitutional challenge. And so that was actually struck down. But aside from licensing priority, licensing points, a lot of jurisdictions offer technical assistance and education, right? So this is working in a highly regulated industry is no mean feat. And a lot of folks who are coming into the industry, whether they're social equity or not, don't really have a sense of how to operate in that space, are new to the cannabis industry. They need that technical assistance with compliance, with accounting, with other aspects of the business that they may not be familiar with. So technical assistance is one thing that these programs often provide. Access to capital is a huge issue for social equity applicants, and they don't have the traditional access to capital that a lot of these other businesses have, where whether, Shanita was talking about venture capital, certainly that's been that's filled the void that we've got in the industry because we can't get traditional bank financing for our businesses. And so VCs have stepped up, but people, a lot of folks who are social equity applicants just don't know that world at all, don't have any exposure to that world at all, don't have any access to that world at all. And so that capital is not really available to our folks. And so you've got low interest loan programs and grant programs in some jurisdictions that have social equity ordinances that help to fill that gap as well. So there are a number of different benefits that are provided, and it varies by jurisdiction, but those are the features of most of these social equity ordinances. And
I'm really curious to hear from any of you. This is sort of a difficult and maybe complex question, and I don't know that there's a good answer to it at this point, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts. As alluded to earlier, there have been quite a few instances of abuse around various social equity systems. At the same time, Khurshid, as you brought up, the fact is that in order for companies to have flexibility, they're going to need to sort of not be locked into systems that don't allow them the same opportunities as other businesses to expand, to access capital from other sources. As we know, most of the wealth in the United States is controlled by white people at this point, and they're most of the investors. They're deploying most of the capital in the space. How can we start to approach this issue of making sure that that social equity businesses, or even minority-owned businesses that sort of fall outside of any regulatory social equity system, have access to the same kinds of options and capital as other businesses, while also making sure that they are not sort of being put in a position where it's easy for them to fall victim to predatory practices.
Yeah, I'll give you my perspective on that, David. One, I think that a lot of policymakers aren't business people. So, the policymakers are, there's some really good ones and people who are advocates, but by and large, your number one responsibility is to get reelected. And so, and advocates, a lot of advocates and activists who've done the great work of helping us move the ball forward with respect to medical and now adult use legalization are also not people who have to, necessarily respond to competitive capital. And in an environment where the government is not in a position to, nor do I think it should, be underwriting businesses per se, capital has got to get a return on investment, regardless of where the capital is coming from. Whether it was African American people or anybody else who are investing, they got to get a return on investment on capital. What matters is who is aligning with people in the opportunity, right? So, when you talk about folks that are aligning whose their business or their why is market share, that's something different than people whose why is improving outcomes in communities that have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. And, a why with respect to anyone, will set forth how they behave. So I don't know that there's any such policy that can prevent people from behaving poorly. And there is certainly policy that can prevent businesses from attracting the necessary capital to be competitive. I think what's important also to know. So, how would I do that? I would probably align policymakers with some, business related, probably education systems. You see a lot of public-private partnerships where you might have a school. If I was UCLA, I'd be trying to get with the social enterprise people at UCLA or USC, to try to determine who are, positive actors and what are systems that would really work to really work with DCR in order to, align people based upon the number of opportunities that were going to be allocated in a way that made sense, that produced a long-term outcome and wasn't prohibitive of capital. Like, for instance, a lot of the new ordinance is overbearing, is going to end up having a negative repercussion, negative impact. It's not going to result in what they were hoping as it relates to protecting people. So that's what I think generally.
I want to jump in there and talk about what I've seen on a repeated business level of the obstacles that we face in a holistic point of view. So then you can understand the three things that we need to have in place in order to have Black and brown businesses, women-owned businesses, to be able to boom in this industry. So one, I've spoke on the first thing. You need the resources, the mentorship, the guidance on how to do these things. That is imperative. People have talked about incubator programs. There's a lot of, just webinars, conversations. You need to know how to do this. The second thing you need is access to the capital. And so on my LinkedIn page, literally this morning, I wrote an op-ed about we need banking reform. Safe Banking Act has to go through. We have to get that reform so we can get access to capital. I myself, as a highly educated woman, if I went into the bank today and wanted a loan just on a coffee shop, I would be rejected. So can you imagine the obstacles I have to go through just to get a bank loan in cannabis? It's not existent. And then you look at me, and a lot of people, when I enter the room, they ask me, how did I get there? But yet I'm the most educated person in the room that should be there over everyone else. So again, we're in this industry where we don't have access. Now, given access through reform banking laws will help boom cannabis businesses. And so when I had the opportunity to write the op-ed on it, I went for it because I needed that voice. Again, it's on my LinkedIn page. I encourage you to comment on it. The third thing I want to speak on, besides resources, capital, now we need to focus on the actual, let me back up. So once you have the resources and then you have the money to be able to execute this, you need the opportunity. So what does the opportunity mean? It means the social equity programs. It can mean some of the programs that different MSOs have available if you're not necessarily touching the plant. Let me tell you what that means to me. In the beginning, it was hard for me to compete with the big MSOs. I didn't have the resources that they had. I didn't have the capital. But what I did have is that one opportunity, and I was 1 in 400 that was able to get a medical marijuana license, the first in the nation. And so now I was able to permeate that system, but it's not enough for just one. There's a whole industry out there that everyone can take a part of, but we need the opportunity. So the social equity program is supposed to provide that opportunity. But if you don't have the resources and the capital, you are breaking the effectiveness of these programs. So they need to be inclusive of everything that I specified. If not, you will have MSOs, you will have other capital ventures taking advantage of it. But what the true fact is that you don't want to fail as a social equity partner. If really our investors that are out here listening to us now, we are making the numbers. We have the resources and we have the outreach and we have so much that we can contribute. We're just lacking in one or the other. And then to take a license that it is carved out for us and to be able to economically gain by investing in that, you'll see the return as well. So it is a win-win situation if you go into it with the right intention.
I'll just add that I absolutely agree with Chanda on the impact of the Safe Banking Act. It is a key priority for NCIA, which is the oldest and largest national trade association for the cannabis industry. It's been one of the issues that we've worked on consistently year after year after year, and we're finally making a little bit of headway in the House, but we really need to push for that passage in the Senate as well. But I think that is going to make capital available on an equal basis to our communities, and I think that is going to have a leveling effect to some degree. There's still a lot of work left to be done, but that's going to help immensely. And then I would also agree wholeheartedly with what Karim said in terms of the regulators not having a business background. I don't know how many of these regulators, especially in DCR, for example, are intimately familiar with the concept of dilution, right? And if you take a position that somebody must always maintain 51%, no matter what, well, how does that applicant then go out and raise money in year 4 or 5 when they say, oh, I want to buy 5 new storefronts, but I don't have the capital, from recurring revenue. You have to if you have to bring on investors rather than debt, you're going to have to give them a piece, and that has to, everything has to equal 100% at the end of the day. And so I think that there are reasonable things that you can do, like saying, hey, you have to provide preemptive rights to these social equity applicants, so that if you do have to bring in additional capital, that they are actually able to, with their distributions and their recurring revenue, they're able to keep pace with that and and buy additional shares to keep that 51%. But if they don't have the shares or don't want to, you shouldn't make them, and you shouldn't require that they have to do that. You also shouldn't require that they necessarily have to can only transfer the business to another social equity applicant if, in again year 5 or year 10, a big MSO approaches them and says, hey, we want to give you a successful exit, and that entrepreneur wants to take it. They should have that option. It shouldn't be that they can only get out of the business by death or incapacity. That seems a bit unreasonable. So I think that there are things that can be done with these very well-meaning protective provisions to moderate them a little bit, make them a little bit friendlier to not only investors, but also to the social equity applicant themselves.
Great, thank you. So
yeah, I know we're coming to the end of the segment. Are we all frozen? It's just me.
No, we see and hear you.
Okay, yeah, I know we're coming to the end of the segment, and I agree with almost everything Khurshid said, especially with respect to preemptive rights. One thing I think is interesting is I have a real concern around people turning over quickly, leveraging these opportunities to exit based upon valuation in limited license markets. And the goal here is for people to make money and for us to, for a long period of time, like to improve our outcomes in our communities generally. And more than likely, if they exit quickly, that money will go away. There's also like success is a carrot to behavior that's in all of our interests. And so like long-term success really matters. People who own businesses and are successful in business are civically engaged. They are, some of the most impactful members of community and in society generally. And in our communities that have been so devastated by the war on drugs, having people that are visible, that exist, whether they are operating in community or not. I prefer people not to operate in inner cities because it's the hardest place to operate, where you typically have the lowest EBITDA and top line sales. So, in our philosophy is go to where you're going to go make the most money, like people have done in our communities, and then come back to, live in our communities and then improve them with the money that we go make wherever we can make the most money, right? Drive the most revenue on the top line sales, but keep the businesses for long periods of time, 10, 20 years, keep it in your family, learn how to get good at it, take some of that revenue and invest in a shopping center in community, build wealth over time and leverage this business as an annuity.
I don't disagree with anything that Karim just said. And again, just to add, there's got to be some point short of death or incapacity where you should be able to transfer that business, right? So I'll take 20 years, I'll take 30 years. That sounds great, but I don't want to have to wait till I'm dead to transfer the business.
All right,
and
thanks.
I just want to send a special shout out to all the texts and the love that I'm receiving. It's really nice to see you all. I know it's been very hard on everyone during COVID-19 and some of the things that we're facing, but God bless you all, and I look forward to the day we can be together again.
Thank you. So we're gonna move into our next talk with Eugene Monroe. I think most of you are sticking around for Q&A as well. So we'll see you back on in just a few minutes. But I wanted to take this opportunity to have a conversation with Eugene Monroe, who is a former NFL player and cannabis investor and entrepreneur. He's been really heavily involved in the cannabis industry, in advocacy, working with the NFL Players Association on the pain management board. It's really he's bringing a whole new sort of athletic focused perspective to the industry, and there are quite a few other athletes who have joined him in this advocacy, and it's an area that I think has a lot of power. And I know that Eugene, you've had a lot of experiences since you joined the cannabis industry that shed light on some of these issues. So I wanted you to first take a moment to sort of introduce yourself and maybe tell us why you got into the cannabis space after football.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for that intro. Thank you guys for this platform and, choosing to cover such an important topic. One of the, first and, foremost topics of discussion as our country continues state by state legalizing cannabis. This is priority number one, at least on my list, in terms of things of importance. And that's creating that social equity with a focus on social justice, reform, and repair from all the harm that's been done thus far. But just to introduce myself a little bit, for those of you who might not know who I am, I'm Eugene Monroe, and I'm a former NFL player. That's essentially how I entered the cannabis space. While I was in the NFL, I started another business. My partner and I started investing in real estate and doing mixed-use development in Baltimore and North Carolina and some other places we have projects. And I found myself looking for an alternate solution for pain management while I was playing. I had a number of injuries, and each time I was injured, the prescription was more and more oxycodone and more anti-inflammatories. And I got to a point where I understood that, I can't live a healthy life, but at the same time, be sucking down these pills 4 and 5 times a day just to get through a season. So I started researching cannabis and started traveling across the country. My first stop was with the Realm of Caring in Colorado, which, I was introduced to, a facility full of mothers and their children with, debilitating health conditions. And cannabis was literally keeping these kids alive. So that really, sparked my interest into, understanding more about how cannabis could be effective on a medical level. But it was impossible to put cannabis, marijuana, whatever you want to call, into a search engine and not see the bustling investment activity. So I had noticed that state of Maryland, where I lived at the time, had a process for awarding licenses for cultivation, processing, and dispensing. And so I made my way into that market by way of investment with Green Thumb Industries, which, after retirement, I was fortunate to work on a partner level with and help, grow that business and just learn so much during that process. My people ask me, sort of how to get into the industry, and especially a lot of people of color who can relate with me. And so, it's my roadmap is sort of unique, right? I use the world of athletics to make way in cannabis, and even now. And for the other athletes that have entered this space, it's important to know just the weight of, that athletic background and prominence. It opens doors and gives you information you otherwise might not have. So just, a note for all of my minority athletes out there that might be listening in, that you can certainly use a lot of those skill sets you developed in that arena here in cannabis. Outside of Green Thumb, I've got investments along with them in about 15 cannabis markets across the country. And I've done a number of things from designing facilities and so on. It's a very unique time, especially starting my sort of cannabis career out with a predominantly white, now, MSO. We weren't at the time, but, I have a perspective on how the business is operated from that degree, but also, helping other people who want to enter the space who, don't have the resources that, the business did, that I entered. So, this has been interesting, just hearing, the problems that people, have dealt with in their own businesses, and the things that are important, as this industry continues to grow.
Thanks. And you've been an investor in the space for a long time, and I'm curious, from an investor perspective, what have your experiences been like in the cannabis industry, being a Black investor?
You know, it's been very interesting. You know, being in a room where, you know, all your partners are white guys, you know, I never really felt like anyone cared that I was there, you know, just like, okay, that's the Black athlete that's on the team. And so, you know, I don't feel like that, you know, caused any ever issue for me, just because, you know, I'm learning the things, the ins and outs of the business, how these things are run. You know, I'm in this bubble, insulated very differently from your minority who doesn't have the ability to do so. And I felt the full weight of those struggles that we hear these minority business owners talk about, really on my first venture in cannabis outside of Green Thumb, where I was called by Dr. Sue Sisley, who I'm sure many of you are aware of. She was on a team looking to earn a license in the state of Louisiana. And she called me, you know, having been friends, understanding the experience level I've had in the business, knowing that I could join their team and become a strong asset for them. So, you know, fast forward, you know, I come into that business, help that group earn the license. Shortly after, there was a power struggle between the majority ownership of that company, and all of the minority owners were essentially Black, you know, just pushed out. Like, we were given no information. The company changed hands without us really, you know, knowing anything. And so, and at this point, you know, some of us remain, you know, on paper owners of a company that, you know, we don't know, you know, what's going to become of that. And it's been since taken over by Ilera Healthcare. And so, you know, being on one side, you know, having failure certainly, but, you know, seeing the type of success that happens when you're well equipped, when, you know, financing is not an issue, versus, you know, watching, and not just me, right? For me, you know, that situation, while it was hard, because quite literally, my Blackness was used to help them earn the license. Southern University told Advanced Biomedics that that their team wasn't Black enough, that there wasn't enough Black ownership. So after an initial meeting, we came back to the drawing board, and, you know, simply because they needed to see Black ownership, not for, you know, any merit, not for my ability or contribution, simply because they needed more Blackness, they awarded me another point of ownership. And as soon as the contract was signed, everyone disappeared. So, you know, there's that stark contrast of, you know, well-resourced company versus, you know, going out and, you know, approaching this license opportunity, being a minority, and being shut out of the opportunity that really only exists because you're Black and we're there. So, you know, getting issues like this right out of the gate are going to be critical. You know, having shadow means of representing minorities in your businesses, you know, shouldn't be allowed moving forward. You know, there needs to be some guidelines and some checks on how these things are rolled out, right? We can't have another state roll out a slew of licenses where people who have the resources to, you know, buy the best teams. Literally, you go out and pay people the most money, you know, who are best qualified to do this. Well, you know, you have very capable and qualified minorities who don't have that same access to capital, who haven't been donating to these politicians to, you know, get that backdoor entry into that license, you know. So, you know, there's much work to be done in that regard.
Thank you. We're about to move on to Q&A here. I'm wondering if you have one last thought that you want to leave leave investors with, or
Yeah,
leave our audience with?
think, you know, investors or really anyone, you know, as we look at how cannabis is evolving, I think the most important issue at hand, and, you know, while we talk about business and the opportunity to create wealth, what we also can't discount is the fact that, you know, we're in this industry growing and selling weed while the people who did it right before us are still in jail. And in these places that legalize, they remain in jail for, you know, it should be, you know, if everyone's, you know, first and foremost cause wherever you play a role in, you know, policy to make that, to make correcting those wrongs, you know, the biggest driver of this movement.
Thank you. And thank you to all the panelists. We're about to open this up to Q&A. One final thought that I'd like to leave you with before we go to Q&A is that you know, I've been in the cannabis industry for about 11 years, and I've been with Arcview for 7 of those, and it's really been an interesting journey. And I think that Arcview has a very unique role to play. We sit at the intersection of cannabis and capital in this industry, and because so much of the capital in the United States is white, and in the world is white, that means that you know, our investors are disproportionately white. We have amazing investors of all backgrounds, people like Eugene Monroe and Khurshid Khoja, who have and are doing amazing things for diversity and inclusion and equity in the industry. I would encourage any of our investors, no matter what race you are, to really start thinking hard about what you're investing in, how you're investing, how you're showing up in the industry, and come to us, use us as a resource. We have a lot of work to do. We have not always done as much as we could, and we are continually trying to do more. We have several really fantastic programs that we're rolling out around mentorship. The projects that we're working on the consulting side, we're trying to identify projects that have outsized impact when it comes to these issues. The greenhouse grow that I mentioned earlier is actually going to sit on a plot of land that we'll own that will be significantly larger than this operation needs. So if you have another cannabis business and you're interested in helping to build sort of a campus for job placement for formerly incarcerated people, please reach out to me. I'd be happy to discuss that. And all in all, if you don't know where to start, please reach out to me. I'm happy to have these conversations with you one-on-one to share our connections, our resources, to make sure that as an industry we can all move forward in a really productive way. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lewis, who has some audience questions.
Great, thank you so much, David. And bring all the panelists back up again. First, I just want to say that I'm truly honored to be included in this conversation and represent the audience's voices in our audience Q&A now. You know, as a Korean American, I won't pretend to understand the Black and Brown experience, but as a person of color who has spent 6 years in the cannabis industry, 5 of which were here with Arcview, working with thousands of mostly white entrepreneurs and investors, I appreciate how much we've represented people of color today and creating a space with all of you to address these issues. I'm sure the conversation won't end today either, so thank you very much. Now, before we get to the audience Q&A, audience members, I want to first apologize if I don't get to your question. There are more than 200 of you on this call, and we have 15 minutes, well, a little bit less than that, to pick out a few out of dozens of questions that have come in so far. So if I don't get to your question, I don't mean to exclude you, but if you are an Arcview member, you can join us in the after party where we'll be taking a deeper dive and continuing this discussion after this portion of the webinar ends. So the first question that I have here, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit because there have been a lot of questions about current implementations of social equity and diversity programs. Khurshid, Eugene, and Karim, this question is for you. Chanda, who all of you heard from earlier, unfortunately couldn't participate in this portion of the call. But Khurshid, Eugene, Karim, this question is for you. And Shanita and Stephen, feel free to chime in as well if you'd like. So here's the question. I won't name names, but there are states that seem to have rushed to put forth diversity and equity programs by prioritizing social equity licenses. I think the spirit and intention was good in these programs, but as these programs played out, they realized that license holders from historically marginalized communities who are used to maybe a more underground market cannot adapt quickly enough to traditional business practices, whether that's bookkeeping and filing for taxes, inventory management across a regulated supply chain, etc., which ultimately led to shuttering doors and dwindling participation by people of color. If we can go back in time and restructure these programs, what words of advice do you have for policymakers and stakeholders listening in, given the lessons that we learned so far? Khurshid, why don't we start with you, then Eugene, then Karim.
Sure. I would say, I mean, with respect to kind of the education and technical points, you know, a lot of these programs are providing these resources, but they're doing it after folks qualify, right? And so they're not getting that assistance up front necessarily. The same is true of certain requirements like having real estate, right? Like how do you have a social equity applicant go out and buy real estate given that the market is already very tight with respect to the available inventory for licensed premises, right? For running these businesses. So to the extent that you have all these sort of requirements front loaded, that's actually hurting the social equity applicant. And so if I could go back and advise folks on how to do this, I would say things like, don't make them go get the real estate up front. Put them in a position so that they don't have to have the capital up front. Guarantee their loans before they go and find a partner so that they are not you know, falling victim to predatory practices. They've got some cash that they can bring to the table as well, right? A little bit of matchmaking. You know, some jurisdictions have done matchmaking between social equity applicants and other actors, other applicants who want to incubate them or support them. How about you know, matchmaking and mentoring just among folks who want to be social equity applicants, so that you can find the folks who have some of the technical background and pair them with folks who maybe have other things that they're bringing to the table, but maybe they don't have the accounting background, maybe they don't have the supply chain management, but you know, you pair them with somebody like Shanita, and all of a sudden, like, they're in the game, you know, and maybe Shanita's getting something valuable out of that as well. And so having that matchmaking up front, I think, would be a valuable service to add. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, from my perspective, you know, I think, you know, the very fact that these communities are targeted, you know, sort of misses the mark, right? Yes, we want to encourage economic activity in those communities. However, you know, we know this is a difficult business to get off the ground and run, and you're literally, you know, dictating that these businesses are born from people who come from some of the least educated communities in our country. And, you know, I say that looking at the process in Maryland where, you know, doctors, lawyers, real estate professionals, people capable of handling all of, you know, the things that you confront in the cannabis business, you know, we're completely shut out by, you know, some of the, you know, largest states' political donors, right? So, you know, just inherently the way these licenses are launched, and particularly targeting specific communities, right? You know, for you to say that, you know, this person has to come from this certain neighborhood, well, you know, I think that sort of, you have this issue, right, where now we're finding that, okay, these people might not be as capable. Well, from the start, we have a bigger problem where, you know, there already hasn't been investment in their community. And so the level of education coming out of that community really isn't up to par.
Awesome. Karim?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, that character matters. So, I think there's value in allocating licenses in a meritorious process that also measures people's ability to show up with the kind of character that's consistent with business ownership that is in the interest of community. So a way to do that. The other thing I'd say is there are already successful, to Eugene's point, successful ethical business people in states and in cities. Policymakers should be gathering a panel or a committee of individuals who understand the landscape and who understand how to be successful in business, attract capital, et cetera, and leverage them to help to define what social equity, what a social equity program ought to look like in any specific jurisdiction. And then, I think that, look, Black and brown people operate every retail we go to in this country. Multi-million-dollar Rite Aids, multi-million-dollar, you name, from Home Depot to you name it. You go into any place where you're really experiencing retail, and by and large, you're seeing people of color up to and including the general manager. So they learn with systems, they know how to do inventory, they know how to manage teams, they know how to put schedules together. And these aren't people, for the most part, who have who've completed secondary education. So we're not stupid, we're not well resourced, and we haven't been trained, right? We haven't been exposed to, and we've experienced a disproportionate amount of trauma by and large, because America got a poor people problem, and by and large, Black and brown people are disproportionately poor, right? And so, you got to be able to address all of those things comprehensively as we decide who gives us the best chance to achieve the outcome that we're looking for, which is people from these communities, right, getting more money than would have otherwise have been the case, significantly more money than would otherwise be the case, and leveraging these limited license opportunities to do that, so that they'll take that money and not only improve their outcomes, health, wealth, educational attainment for themselves and their kids, but also be a contributing member to community in a healthy way long-term, so that our communities improve outcomes through cannabis licensing opportunities long-term.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Next question, and this will be unfortunately the last audience question that we'll have here, but this one is for Shanita and Stephen. I want to address an elephant in the room: the anger in the United States running through communities of color. We see it being expressed in the news, such as in Portland, for example, where they are in their 58th day of protests. That frustration can be channeled in policy decisions as well. There was someone in the audience who asked this question, who wants to get your opinions on barring those who have profited from the war on drugs: law enforcement, investors in private prisons, legislators who have opposed legalization, etc. They want to bar them from participating now in the cannabis industry. Do you think we should, in some ways, limit the participation of those who are historically against legalization, but are now seeking to profit off of it? Stephen, why don't we start with you and then Shanita?
Well, I would, it is a very provocative thought, and I can say I disagree with it. The larger thing, though, as we talk about the elephant in the room, and as we look at the whole Black Lives Matter movement, is how we rethink policing in the United States, because the role of policing has been so much defined in communities of color around cannabis, right? And the police cannabis quite differently in South Central than they do in Beverly Hills. And we look at the 660,000 people arrested, but that doesn't begin to tell the full story, because you multiply that by a factor of 4 or 5, and then you're talking about all of the Black and brown kids stopped by police, harassed by police, intimidated, and sometimes killed by the police on suspicion of having drugs. So, holding perpetrators accountable, I'm all for. To me, barring people from the industry is one aspect, perhaps, of accountability. But but I certainly want to explore every realm of accountability for people who've been responsible for the war on drugs.
You know, it's not an elephant in the room for anybody who's in regular communication and working with people like myself. I've been mad for almost 38 years, you know, as long as once I realized what was happening in this world. As far as what's happening with the conversations today, Friday, a week ago, Peter Tosh's son died after being locked up for 3 years, or excuse me, after being locked up for a cannabis charge. 3 years later, he's finally passed from the injuries that he sustained in an attack in jail. Now, this is the son of an advocate for legalization. His sister, since his arrest and injury, has been an advocate, has been in many of the same rooms that most of you all have been in. And nobody in this industry has said anything. So, you know, we're mad all the time. Most of you, if you've seen me before, I've put on my game face and I've come into the room to talk about solutions and try to move this thing forward with no emotion involved. But what you've seen recently is the top that can't be put back on, the game face that we can't walk into a room with anymore, or else we're going to deal with another, for me, 20 years of being an industry that claims to be diverse. But when I step out of this boardroom, you don't care what happens to me. My people are shot and killed in this country, arrested, you know, not treated in hospitals. They don't get loans for homes. They don't get anything that we should have access to because we are citizens of this country, human. And so I don't know if we can go as far as to bar these folks. I mean, look at Boehner. He's a part of one of the largest companies right now, right? But I know as a consumer, I'm not going to support a company that's led by folks who are not walking the walk. So can we bar them? No, but I'd like to see more of the folks that have been a part of pushing legalization and doing it the right way, continue to leverage that so that we get what we want and we have enough players in this space that we can choose who to support.
Awesome. Thank you, Shanita. Vote with your dollar. Thanks so much. And I want to thank all the panelists here today, Stephen, Khurshid, Shanita, Eugene, Karim, Chanda, who had to jump off early, and David, of course, for all the wonderful moderation that you did over the last 2 hours. I want to thank you all for your time and your attention today. We'll be closing out. Again, thank you so much. This is definitely a conversation that we need to have, and this definitely won't be the only conversation that's happening in this industry, and certainly not the last. So thank you.